Barbarians, chapters 25 and 26. The Edge of the Blade. Fly me up on a silver wing past the black where the sirens sing. Warm me up in a nova's glow and drop me down to the dream below, 'cause I'm only a crack in this castle of glass. Hardly anything there for you to see, Lincoln Park, Castle of Glass. Admiral Fujimoto contemplated the star display as she sipped her tea, and for the umpteenth time tried to get inside the head of her opponent. Ever since the war began, the Konhim had been one step ahead of them, and if they were to have any chance at a decisive victory, that had to change. The problem was that as the attackers, they held the initiative. There were multiple targets for them to choose from, and unless the fleet could arrive soon enough to make a difference, that bloody equation was not going to improve in their favor. Which begged the question, where would Jiaj strike next? The attack on U-12 seemed to vindicate Marshal Antuma's belief they would strike at random, but the more she studied the map, the more it seemed they were almost trying too hard to throw the Navy off their scent. So, someplace far from U-12, on the opposite side of the sphere of triumvirate worlds, someplace far enough from the central system she had been basing the fleet to launch their assault and then disappear before she could arrive on site. Helene highlighted the possible targets on her display and crunched the numbers, but there were still too many possibilities to cover with any reasonable chance of success. Unless... Admiral Fujimoto leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. It was a gamble, a huge one in fact, but if she was right, her odds of finding the Konhim fleet improved considerably. If she was wrong, however, she'd be committing one of the strategic cardinal sins, and possibly court the destruction of her entire fleet. But the more she stared at that map, the more convinced she became it was the only course of action left that had any chance of success. Pressing an icon on her display, her first officer appeared on the screen. "I'm sending you coordinates," she informed him. "I want the fleet ready for transit within the hour." Her XO looked dubiously at the information she'd relayed. "Are you sure about this, ma'am?" "I'm sure," she nodded. "Let me know when we're ready to get underway." Fujimoto out. She didn't blame her first officer for his skepticism, but unless they took the risk, millions, maybe billions more would die. Diaksh Jiaj. Guyaz stared out into the black and contemplated their next offensive. They'd been forced to briefly call a halt to their campaign in order to effect repairs, some of which due to the damage caused by the rogue human spies. Some of his officers believed their mission to be a failure, that given the explosion which had blown them into space, they could not have survived. But he was less convinced. Time and again they had shown themselves to be a clever and resourceful species, if not their equals in combat. It was a pity they had chosen to ally themselves with the triumvirate, for if they had sided with the Konhim, their enemy would have fallen in a matter of weeks. The humans had pecked away at his fleet, though the bulk of his ships were intact and combat-ready. Still, he was steadily taking losses, and as far from home as they were, he needed to husband his resources. That was the primary reason they had temporarily anchored. But it also gave him an opportunity to consider their options. When they had first departed on their great crusade, the way forward had been simple and clear. Destroy the ancient enemy that had once tried to destroy them, and finally give their forebears justice and peace. But while they had gone from one victory to the next, there was a growing sense of unease within him he could not easily dismiss. He had defeated the humans at every turn, but they were learning, and each time they met in battle a new wrinkle was added, a new tactic introduced. Was it possible that one day they would unlock the stratagem that would secure victory for the triumvirate? And if so, what would their options be then? Part of him wished to simply dismiss that possibility out of hand, but honesty compelled him to accept the fact that reality was not his to dictate. If they were defeated here, could they simply retreat back home? Would the triumvirate allow them to, unmolested? Somehow he thought not. Certainly the humans wouldn't, and it had become painfully clear they were the greatest obstacle to victory the Konhim horde faced. They had learned much about these humans from the prisoners taken on a handful of worlds. They had even managed to secure 3 human corpses for study, though as of yet they had not managed to capture one alive. But the more he studied the problem, the more he realized three very simple truths. 1. To defeat the triumvirate, he would be forced to smash his way through the humans. 2. The humans were much smaller in number than the rest of the triumvirate, though highly visible amongst their military. 3. The humans held only a small scattering of worlds, including their homeworld known as Earth. Oh, it was tempting. Take the humans out of the equation by attacking their homeworld directly. The triumvirate would still be there waiting after all. But they had not spent all these millennia planning the defeat of the humans, and he was loath to divert the fleet from their crusade. It would take a significant amount of resources to level their planet, resources already allocated for the triumvirate. It would also widen the scope of the war to a degree he was uncomfortable with, and that was what stayed his hand. Though if the situation changed, it might become necessary after all. The Ophipteran world. Zaronk grew larger on their monitors, and as they drew nearer, Giage searched for any signs of the humans, and found none. "Locate the shield generators before we launch the breakers," he ordered, "and destroy them the instant the shield collapses. I do not wish a repeat of our previous attack." "Understood, Diaksh," his tactical officer acknowledged, already searching for orbiting satellites. "So another world falls to the faithful," Giage thought with a satisfied smile. "Soon they will all be reduced to cinders, and our work will be complete." Her communications officer looked up from her screen in alarm. "Admiral, priority distress signal." "Where?" Fujimoto demanded. "Zaronk, ma'am," the officer replied, as a wolfish grin appeared on her face. "Got you, by God!" she cried out, clenching her fists in triumph. "Fujimoto to all squadrons! Best speed to Zaronk!" Zaronk's shields fell like the others before it, and soon after the generators were located and destroyed. The bombardment was going well, and Giage watched the devastation on his monitors with an abiding sense of satisfaction. It was almost too simple, and despite the problems they had caused for the crusade, he owed the humans a debt. Without them, their victories would have felt hollow, for the triumvirate was not the dreaded enemy of old. They had grown soft and weak over the millennia, and without the intervention of the humans, it was clear they would have fallen without landing a single blow. There was little honor to be found in defeating an opponent unable to fight back, but in this instance there was a blood debt yet to be paid. The humans, however, were an honorable enemy, worthy of their blades. Granted, they did not fight as well as the Konhim, but they were clever and resilient. They at least offered a challenge, whereas the triumvirate did not. In fact, "Sensor alert!" his tactical officer suddenly called out. Multiple ships entering the system on a least time course for the planet. He paused for a moment as he double-checked his readings and nodded in confirmation. "It is the triumvirate fleet, Diaksh." Giage fingered his blade thoughtfully. This was certainly unexpected. How had the humans tracked them to this planet? They had not been followed, for any ship trailing them would have been quickly discovered. Had they left some sort of trail? He could not imagine what kind of spoor the enemy would be able to track in the coldness of space, but perhaps they had discovered something new. If so, that would force them to radically change their plans, though somehow he did not think that was the case here. Had they predicted this attack by some means? Possible, but yet again the question would be how. Questions for another time, Giage thought grimly. "Prepare for action," he ordered, a cold smile appearing on his face. "We have faced them before, and emerged victorious each time, and we will do so again." His crew grinned at each other, eager to prove themselves once more as their great ships wheeled to face the enemy. The human ships began disgorging the small fighter craft as expected, forming themselves into the familiar attack patterns they had seen before. "Advance the fleet and engage the enemy," Giage ordered as his ships moved forward, eager for battle. But even as they advanced, the enemy began to pull back, keeping the distance between them open as they stayed just out of weapons range. Giage's brow furrowed in confusion. Why would the humans scramble to bring their fleet against him, only to avoid action once they arrived? It made no sense, and when something made no sense in battle, he was instantly suspicious. Still, they were a known quantity, and if he pressed hard enough he was certain he could crush them, or at least send them packing. "Increase to flank speed," he ordered, and fire the instant the enemy is within range." That proved easier said than done. Every move he made to close the gap, the humans would slither out of his grasp. They were toying with him, and that was a very dangerous game to play. It also made him increasingly wary. Why? What was their plan? They most certainly had one, but how did this ridiculous dance serve that? Did they think they could somehow draw him away from the planet by offering themselves up as a target instead? If so, it was a fool's game, for they could not evade him forever. Oh, they were being quite clever about it, using the other bodies in the system to their advantage, but each turn they made brought him just a bit closer, and soon— "New contact!" his tactical officer suddenly cried out. "Multiple vessels entering the system, on a converging course." "What?" he said in shock, whirling around to view the monitors, as new icons appeared, one after the other. Admiral Fujimoto's eyes gleamed in cold satisfaction as the rest of the fleet emerged in the system. "Surprise, motherfucker!" she growled hungrily. "Now I ain't saying it's right or it's wrong, but maybe it's the only way. Talk about your revolution, it's Independence Day. Let freedom ring. Let the white dove sing. Let the whole world know that today is a day of reckoning. Let the weak be strong. Let the right be wrong. Roll the stone away, let the guilty pay, it's Independence Day. Martina McBride, Independence Day." I've always been a rocker at heart, but no one does revenge like a country girl. "So you're certain this isn't something I need to be concerned with?" Marshal Antuma asked the minister. Leandra chuckled. "I think you can safely say we have an understanding," she smirked. "Whatever the other ministers might have been planning, I can assure you they aren't planning it now." Antuma laughed along with her as a Sortor aide entered the room and handed him a tablet. He stopped laughing immediately. "God damn it," he grimaced. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Obviously nothing good. He slid the tablet over to her. "It seems Helene has kicked off Sucker Punch a little earlier than planned," he said frostily, before punching an icon on his console. "This is Antuma," he spoke in crisp, professional tones. "Issue movement orders immediately for our ground forces on Uzanks. Tell them—" He paused for a moment as he shared a look with Minister Singh. "Tell them they are to expedite transport for Zaronk." The early engagements against the Konhim had shown that the Comet fighters, while certainly agile and deadly at close range, simply didn't have the ability to stand toe-to-toe against the massive enemy ships. The humans had plans for several classes of ships on the drawing boards, all ready to put into production, but even the smallest class would take over a year to complete. It had become readily apparent that the triumvirate did not have a year, so the engineers went back to work, looking at what they could build right now, and came up with what had to be the ugliest, ungainliest, most brute force application of a warship ever designed. In essence, they took a Ronin tank, stripped off the treads, and slapped on a pair of massively overpowered engines, swapped out the single-barrel railgun for a pair of tri-barrel antimatter turrets, grafted on enough armor to make a battleship swoon, and pronounced it good. Some wag had dubbed it the HK, after an obscure 20th century cinematic entertainment series, and the name stuck. The shipyards had been hard at work cranking them out, and now that the first two squadrons had been activated, Admiral Fujimoto had decided to take a chance. They were not agile, but then they had never been intended to be. If the Comet was a dagger, then the HK was a battle axe. Helene Fujimoto had realized, while looking at the star map, that there was no single place she could plant her flag and hope to catch the Konhim fleet, so she took a gamble and did the one thing all military leaders have pounded into their heads to never do: split their forces. Dividing your units into smaller groups simply hands your enemy an engraved invitation to what is known as defeat in detail, an innocuous-sounding euphemism that sends any experienced officer straight to their whiskey bottle. It allows the enemy to bring their entire force to bear on each smaller unit in turn, gobbling them up one at a time like so much candy. Admiral Fujimoto had understood that risk all too well, and did it anyway. There had simply been no other way to cover enough of the sector, so each task force had been given strict instructions. Whichever was the closest was to arrive on site and then avoid action at all costs, until the other group emerged in system. It was risky as hell, for if they were unable to avoid action. But now both task forces were in sight of Zayaronk, and the Comet squadrons had abandoned their dance with the Konim, making a beeline to link up with their HK brothers. Dyaksh Jiaj Guyaz recognized their intended plan in an instant, and the one thing he could not do was let the two enemy forces unite. Unfortunately, he was badly out of position, and even if he risked burning out his engines to prevent it, he could only manage extreme weapons range before the two units merged. He'd get some hits, but not enough. It seems the humans have chosen their killing ground, he thought grimly. So be it. He still had the advantage in ship weight, but this new fleet consisted of vessel types unknown to him. Who knew what they might be capable of, though it seemed he was about to find out. What happened next would not be the one-sided slaughter he had enjoyed so far, but a brutal slugging match with no guarantees as to the victor. So what advantage did he still possess? His eyes turned to the monitor and the planet below. If this was to be the final battle, then let it be one for the ages. "Pass the word to all ships," he ordered. "All assault craft are to head for the planet and take the population centers still intact." A thin smile appeared on his face as the order was acknowledged. The enemy could link forces, or they could prevent his assault on the planet. They could not do both. Admiral Fujimoto had breathed a heavy sigh of relief as the HK squadrons entered the system. She'd known roughly how long it would take for the other task force to arrive, and on what vector, and as she maneuvered the fleet to avoid the Konhim, she'd managed to position herself between them. Armchair amateurs might wax poetic about attacking with converging forces to smash the enemy, but actually pulling it off required split-second timing, with units who had trained endlessly together. Since that had been a luxury they were unable to afford, she'd opted instead to join forces first, and then take entire armada into battle against the Konhim fleet. It was the safe move, the smart move, and the one that left her badly out of position when the enemy ships started disgorging assault craft. Helene pounded her armrest in frustration. She yearned to turn back and blow those craft out of the sky, but she knew that was exactly what Jiaj wanted her to do. Oh yes, make a mad dash in with half her forces, only to get chewed to bits while the rest of the fleet looked on helplessly. She was between Scylla and Charybdis, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it, except to ensure the Konim paid dearly when she brought the entire fleet down on them like the wrath of God. "Admiral, incoming message from command," her communications officer announced. "Routing it to your terminal now." She managed not to wince as she reviewed the communique. Kwasi was pissed, and she couldn't blame him one bit. Helene had known full well she was overstepping her authority when she authorized Sucker Punch ahead of schedule. But she simply couldn't stand by and watch another half-dozen worlds razed while they waited to build up their forces. The plan had been to throw 5 HK squadrons at the Konhim, not the paltry 2 she actually possessed, but she'd crunched the numbers and run the sims, and Helene was certain she could pull it off with what she had. Well, reasonably certain. That was the difference between the two of them. Antima was the one who calculated the odds, always making the smart play, and almost never bluffing when he didn't have the cards. She, on the other hand, was the one who operated on instinct, going with her gut as she psyched out her opponent. Helene had known how Kwasi would react had she asked permission, so she didn't. Instead, she'd handed him a fait accompli and nodded in satisfaction at the notice he was sending her the ground forces from Uzonks. God knows they were going to need them. Assuming, of course, she could hold the fleet together until they arrived. Nassat gestured to the last few stragglers of Bravo Company, straining to bring their gear aboard the waiting transport.
"We must hurry,"
he informed them as they worked to secure their equipment. The orders to leave Uzong had arrived unexpectedly, and now the entire army was scrambling to comply. He and Raykret had already said their goodbyes, as she and the other healers had evacuated with the first wave along with the wounded. He was uncertain what he and her were to each other. He knew she cared for him as he did for her, but was it simply because of what they had gone through together? Was their relationship based on nothing more than shared hardship, reinforced with need to cling to someone during their darkest hours. And if it were, could they endure? It was a question for which he had no answers. It seemed there were many such questions, especially now that he commanded Bravo Company, albeit temporarily. They had just received a new batch of recruits fresh from basic, and he shuddered at how incredibly wide-eyed and callow they were. It was difficult to believe he had once been just like them, not so long ago, and he constantly reminded himself of that fact as he put them through their paces, preparing them as best he could for what was to come, and tried desperately not to think how many of those eager young faces would not live to see the war's end. There had been one other person he had needed to speak to besides Rykret before their departure, and he had managed it only minutes before the first wave lifted. Sergeant Lin's condition had improved considerably since their arduous trek, but he was still a long way from full recovery. There were so many questions he needed to ask him, so many concerns churning inside him as he once again questioned the Army's wisdom in making him Bravo's commander. Did they see something within him he could not? Or were they simply that desperate? The brief conversation had not gone as he expected. He had gone to him as he once had as a young acolyte to the venerable Ishre, when that ancient monk had still held his respect. But Lin would have none of it. "Call me Jehil," he'd chuckled. "We're the same rank now, and I'd say you've earned the right." His tongue had absolutely balked at such familiarity. "I must know what I am supposed to do," he'd asked softly, feeling the weight upon his shoulders. "I am not ready for what is to come." Lin had simply smiled. "You're ready, Nasat, but if it's wisdom you're looking for, there's just one thing you need to know." Nasat held his breath, waiting in awe as the human who had taught him so much prepared to impart the sagacity of the ages to him. But Lin surprised him yet again. "Do what you gotta do," he said quietly. "Everything else is bullshit." He was still pondering the meaning of those words as the ramp doors closed and the shuttle lifted for orbit.